and I'm here to bring you national cannabis news and hopefully some cats on the cam. I just saw them moments ago. I feel like they want to be on the stream with us, but even enticing them with treats is not always the case. Today we're going to go over some pretty interesting things in the cannabis world. If you've been here before, you know that we always start the top of the hour talking about cannabis busts that have happened around the country, even in legal states, even in places where you might think that cannabis is legal. People are still being arrested, prosecuted, having their stuff seized, and put in prison, as well as, some 30,000 or more people who are currently in prison across the country for cannabis. So we should never forget that. But then we're also going to talk about, why that's still the case. We're going to talk about what's happening in prohibition. We're going to talk about the work that's happening around the world and other countries that are making those changes and what we're hearing about that and the kinds of things that you could be doing to assist with that. We're going to talk about the different issues we're having right now with quality in cannabis and adjacent products across the country. We're going to definitely be going over what's happening here in the state of Michigan, which I'm always excited to bring to you all. Michigan is now the number one state for cannabis in the United States, having just passed California. So we'll be able to talk about all those things. I feel like there is occasionally some misunderstandings of what is occurring in the cannabis industry. So there will also be a segment at the end for you to ask me anything. So if you're here and you want to chat to me, feel free to do so. I am always happy to be answering questions, especially if they're about the industry, and we can really discuss what that's going to look like as well. If I can't answer it, then for sure I will find an expert who can. That is part of being a great community in the cannabis industry, is that we are all actively trying to help each other level up, and that includes you. So don't feel left out. Okay, so speaking of the top of the hour, let's just go ahead and start with cannabis busts from around the country. I feel like, again, that this is pretty important. I believe all the busts that I'm aware of this week are from states with licensed legal programs. So this is a place where you can go buy cannabis in a local dispensary, but that people are still getting arrested and having their plants seized and destroyed by the police. In this case, there's a facility in Oregon. The facility in Oregon, is definitely a traditional market bust in this case. A home grower. He had 800 plants that were seized and destroyed, and was arrested. The largest thing that always frustrates me the most is, this is a rural person growing on their own property, using plants from their own house, but are all of their property has now been seized, and now they have been arrested for illegally cultivating and possessing cannabis plants, which, just goes back to this idea that, only some people are allowed to participate in this industry, where we have consistently decided that people will go to prison for the plant, even though majority of Americans think that it should be legal, and a majority of Americans think that people shouldn't be going to prison for it. Another place that this has happened recently was Washington State, also a legal state, one of the first two adult recreational legal states in the country. People still being arrested there. In this case, finished pounds, right? So think, turkey bags full of weed were found. Person was arrested. Again, in Washington State. Person was arrested. Why? How did the police find out that they had pounds of marijuana with them? Because they smelled it, and the smell of marijuana was probable cause for them to go ahead and search their vehicle and then seize their stuff and take away their freedom. Would this happen to you? Is that something that you think should happen? If you smell like weed, should you be able to be searched? I think most of us would agree that that's not a reason to be searched any longer, if it ever really was a reason to be searched. As if, you know, millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of Americans are consuming cannabis legally in their state programs every day. Why would the smell of marijuana be a reason to stop someone, or when someone is stopped, to search their vehicle and take their things and their freedom? It seems a little strange to me. Doesn't it seem strange to you? Moving right along, we also had a pretty big bust in Oklahoma. In this case, over 1,000 plants were seized. This is an indoor grow bust, so not a rural bust in any case. You know, Oklahoma has probably the largest amount of growers anywhere in the country. Their ability to get into the system was much easier than the license system, was much easier than anywhere else in the country. I think that probably created some problems because there was not enough people to consume all the cannabis that they were growing in Oklahoma. And so people have decided to leave, but then they remember that they really liked growing the plant, or they had facilities that they wanted to grow the plant in, or they were just really good at it. And, you know, these kinds of things are important. I feel like the bigger importance of this is, in this case, that it's both the local police department and the Oklahoma DEA and the Oklahoma licensing group that did this bust. So, you know, right here in Michigan, we aren't really seeing that, where our cannabis regulatory agency is saying, hey, if you're outside the license system, you know, that's the Michigan State Police's responsibility. So they aren't the ones going in and seizing plants and destroying them and destroying property in that way. And I can appreciate that, but that was definitely not the case here in Oklahoma, where, again, even though it's a licensed, legal adult use state, people are still being arrested for engaging with the plant in any way. And I feel like that is and continues to be something that I personally really worry about, because until we get to the point where prohibitionists don't want to see all of us in prison, people are going to be imprisoned, right? Until we stop thinking that the plant is any more dangerous than tomatoes, people are still going to treat us in a negative light, whether it's in a negative light because our neighbors don't like us, or a negative light because the government doesn't like us, or the police are uncomfortable by our presence. Or if really it's just that, okay, they like you, but only if you have, you know, millions of dollars for a license. You know, it's still not okay. You know, it shouldn't be okay for millionaires to benefit from the plant. We should all be benefiting from the plant equally, whether we're doing it for our personal use or to, you know, provide service to our community or to our church. These things are important, and we should consider that. So, moving past cannabis busts that happened around the country, you know, let's talk a little bit more about what's going on the prohibition side. You may or may not be aware, but the Supreme Court recently was looking at a case that we were hopeful would mean that your Second Amendment rights as a cannabis user or operator would be reinstated. Sadly, that is not yet the case. They decided they didn't want to hear that case, and they kicked it back to the lower courts to re-review. This is a sad day for us. You know, there's been quite a few court cases that could really impact us, and many that, while people think that it could impact us, don't. So, for instance, I was chatting this week about the change to the Chevron rule and its relation to cannabis. And strangely enough, in the law, in this case, the Controlled Substances Act, it actually gives the executive branch the authority to do the things that some other branches don't have the authority to do. So that the DEA is actually responsible for scheduling in this case, and not the legislature, which I thought was really both disheartening because they haven't been rescheduling cannabis for so long, even though we are in the middle of rescheduling. Public comment period. You have another, what is this? It's the 5th, and you have until the 22nd to submit your comments. So if you haven't, you should. But, you know, this is just another instance where our government is kind of convoluted, where some agencies have the power to be the experts that they are, and some agencies don't have the power to be the experts that they are, based on the whims of the judiciary. And hey, that's just how it is. And we can recognize that that's how it is, and that's something that we, as citizens, might propose to the legislature to change, right? You know, if we want the EPA to have more power or less power, do we necessarily need to go through the courts, which is what's been done in this case, or could we or should we be making sure that our legislators have our interests as constituents at heart, whatever those interests might be? So it's worth noting that prohibitionists are definitely using their voices with the legislature. So if you haven't yet, if this is important to you, if the cannabis plant is important to you, if having access is important to you, if it's important to your family, if it's important to your livelihood, and you aren't actively involved in the conversation about rescheduling, and you aren't actively involved in making sure that they know that it impacts you and your family, and your livelihood and your quality of life, you ought to consider writing a letter or having a phone call or showing up to Washington, D.C. and telling your representative, or going to a town hall and telling your representative how you feel about these things. Because sometimes they don't know until you've told them. And we can't assume that someone else is going to do it for you. I don't. That's why I go to DC twice a year to make sure at least some of our voices are being heard. So if you have a voice and you want to share that with someone and you don't have the means, you can always share it with me, and I will take it with me whenever I go so that we can move through that. All right, next topic of the day, cannabis standards. So as you guys probably know by now, I am an active, involved party with ASTM International, helping to write voluntary consensus standards at the international level across some 96 countries for the cannabis industry. This includes many standards that are currently at ballot right now, including two that are really important. Not that they aren't all important, but there's two that are happening right now that which really have to do with things that are happening in Michigan and California and across the country right now. And specifically, those are on risk assessments for knowing whether or not an ingredient that you're going to add to the system is okay. And I feel like that's really important right now, you know, with what we've seen in California with all sorts of toxic pesticides ending up in things where people thought it was okay to use these because they weren't being tested for and California hadn't told them not to. I'm thinking of you, Stizzy. I saw that quotation from you. That was a little shocking for me since, you know, you're a multi-state operator and you'd think you'd have a quality system that would consider the safety of your consumers in a different way. But in this case, you know, you said that you didn't have to. Well, this standard says, well, actually, anytime you're putting ingredients on cannabis, you know, pesticides, if you're adding them to edibles, if you're putting them in vape products, etc., that you should be doing a risk assessment. And you should have really thought about it. Then you should have written that risk assessment down. And maybe you did, and you thought, hey, actually, yeah, we don't care too much about this pesticide, so we're not even going to test for it, even though we know it's being used in our cultivation facility. But that's okay. Maybe now you've learned. I don't know that that's the case, but perhaps it is. Certainly anytime I'm using anything on a plant, I'm making sure that it's safe for consumption. By doing that level of risk assessment, by asking toxicologists to do that work. And this is exactly what these international standards say that we should do. There's also some international standards out there on terminology. I see a lot of times conversations happening, people trying to figure out what one word means versus another word versus another, especially in the legislature. So if you're a legislator or a regulator and you're trying to write new rules or change rules related to the cannabis industry, fear not, you are not alone. There are international voluntary consensus standards for terminology, and those definitions, well, they've all been voted on by several hundred industry experts, sometimes more than that. And so you can know that it's going to be okay, that the definitions will be consistent and consistently used, and that if we are going to change those definitions, right, that everyone will have an opportunity to vote on those changes, and there will be a notification that the standard has been updated, right? So, those things are all currently out for ballot right now. Terminology has existed for a while, but these are some modifications, adding additional terms and potentially modification to some terms related to the industry and how the industry has evolved over the last 6 years since the terminology has really been voted on in the past. Right? So yeah, hey, that is your ASTM update. Okay, now you could get an update in your email box if you're involved. You're doing the process. I am not kidding. This is something that is always available to you. It's easy to be a member. We meet, mostly monthly across all of the subcommittees. Sometimes bi-monthly, sometimes quarterly, and we have large in-person visits where anybody, even if you're not a member, is welcome to come and participate in the proceedings. Once a summer and once in the winter, so January and June usually. So everybody is welcome, and that means you. Okay. All right. So there's been quite a bit of conversation about the quality of cannabis and the quality of testing in cannabis. And there, as we mentioned last week, there's now a court case suing labs in California for being fraudulent and calling the DCC to account for not making sure that those are okay. It looks like that is also getting ready to start happening here in Michigan. And if in both cases for similar reasons, which we have also seen play out in Oregon and Washington and Arkansas, where labs are saying products are safe. The labs are saying that there are no contaminants in products, but they are not telling the truth. That's right. They're providing false, fraudulent test results, and this is a sad reality. I am still not really sure why anyone would want to be responsible for saying a product was safe and then lie. It seems like there are so many other ways that you could do business in the cannabis industry that don't have anything to do with wanting to be the person who arbitrates to say a product is safe and then lying about that safety. In this case, in California, there were a number of labs that were giving passing test results for pesticide contamination, passing test results for microbiological contamination, when in reality, those products were actually contaminated with these things. In Michigan, we're having a similar issue where, labs are deciding not to report microcontamination. And, the data is really strong for that. And there are some consumer advocacy groups like my own that are actively working together to gather this data from labs and from states to present it to consumers so that you can know, hey, this is not what you think that it is. The product is not as safe as you thought, and you should be considering not only where you're purchasing it from, but where your retail location is purchasing it from. Because in many cases, the product may not be nearly as safe as one might expect it to be. And if, for instance, you have pesticide allergies or sensitivities, or you are a medical patient with a compromised immune system and you can't be exposed to as much microbiological contamination as maybe a healthy adult, right? Those things are important to know. And you should be able to ask for that information. In California and in Michigan, it's required to be on the label, and it's required that if you ask for it, they have to provide that information to you. So if you're worried, ask for it. And if they can't give it to you, don't buy it. If that seems interesting or confusing, I offer to you that it's incredibly important for your own safety that you think about these things. In Michigan, we've been having a problem since earlier this year, right around late February, early March, and actually probably before then, but we became aware of the issue earlier this year. And this issue is specific to contaminants being in our vape products, with synthetic cannabinoids being used, with diluents like MCT oil being used, with pesticides that are not healthy for inhalation being present as contaminants, and people having passing test results for all of these things. Nobody mentioning that MCT oil is present. And when you think about that, I'm glad that the regulator has decided to make the diluents, in this case MCT oil, illegal to have in vape products. And I'm glad that there are some labs that can test for this, and that other labs are getting ready to be able to test for this. I'm sad that producers in the state of Michigan, the largest cannabis producing state, the most license holders, right, decided that they were going to go ahead and use these products without putting them on their label, without telling the consumer that that was what was happening. That's not the intention of a self-regulating industry. You can't say, get off our back, we know what we're doing, we're not harming people, and then also make choices that you don't know what you're doing and you're harming people, right? That's not okay. Michigan is not the first state to ban this substance. It's actually the fourth. And I thought it was really interesting that, the rules are pretty specific that you can't add additives to anything without putting them on your label, right? So I'm expecting that there will be recalls across the state for people who have been doing this in their formulations. And there should be, right? Adulterated products should be recalled, and consumers should be made aware that these products exist and that these products are not safe. And consumers should also be made aware that it's multiple brands across the state. And if you are interested in what those are and you're listening to my stream and you haven't read the news to get the names of those brands, just reach out and I will let you know. Especially, or if you want to say, hey, this is my favorite brand, are they impacted? If they're one of the 5 that were mentioned in the news, I have no problem letting you know. I try not to mention them here, merely because I'm not trying to say, hey, it's only these brands, since we do know that it's other brands in the state that have been impacted, because a couple of these producers do a lot of white labeling. So I don't want you to get a false sense of security that, hey, your product isn't impacted until we're actually certain. And what I've been recommending is that people stop vaping and instead focus on flower products and edible products for the current period of time. I feel like that's important. It's important to make recommendations like that because, sometimes when regulators don't move quickly enough, in my opinion, for recalls, that doesn't mean that consumers can't be made aware of safety issues. And this is one of the ways we can do is say, hey, we're having a problem right now with the quality of vape products in the state of Michigan. If you are concerned about your health, you should consider not consuming those until we get through this. We should hopefully be through this sometime in October. And until then, unless you are certain your product doesn't have that in there, which I'm not entirely sure how you would be unless you're making it yourself, you should probably consider not doing it. We certainly haven't been consuming them in my household for a bit now because of this issue, which I've mentioned many times. Still sad. The cats, they just came to say hello to me, but they didn't go to the cat cam. It makes me sad that you guys don't get to see them. All right, so if we continue moving through, I feel like the Michigan cannabis news is an important subject matter. You may or may not be aware that the legislature is considering combining the medical and adult use programs in the state of Michigan into a single bill, so that all of the licensees in the state of Michigan will now be adult use. No longer will there be a separation. However, there could still potentially be a licensure for Provision Z centers, which would be medical-only establishments in municipalities that don't want adult use in their city. I don't know what they're trying to accomplish with that, but okay, great. So those could still exist, but they would all be under one section of licensing at the Cannabis Regulatory Agency here in Michigan, which I think is interesting. This is currently in its 7th draft. It has been published. You can see this draft today. You can provide comments and feedback about this draft today. If you want to provide them to me, I will provide them to other people who are also participating in this process. I spent about 5 hours with the legislature this week talking about how we can make modifications and changes to the current draft, especially in places where the way it is written today makes the rules rather different. And not just because they've combined medical with adult use, but changing rules for licensees, changing who's responsible for tasks, changing what kind of products are legally allowed in the state of Michigan. And some of those things I feel are probably not intended. It's possible that they are, but I think that that may not be the case. Hey, Yessie, thank you for joining the stream today. So glad to have you with us. I appreciate that greatly. It's always nice to see people on the stream saying hello and chatting us up. So I feel like that's an important thing as well. You know, if you want to talk about what the legislation that's happening in your state or in your country, I am here to help. In recent weeks, I have helped with Florida, with Illinois. I tried to help with Iowa and was sadly unsuccessful. You know, I've helped in Georgia. I've helped in Japan. I'm helping right now in California and in Michigan. You know, when I say I'm helping, that means I am a cannabis consumer advocate. I'm an industry advocate. So I'm actively pursuing opportunities to make sure that the rules increase access that's safe for both operators to join the industry and consumers to have access to the products produced by the industry that are safe and affordable, right? And it can't just be safe and it can't just be affordable. It has to be both, right? So I feel like that's important. I feel like it's important that your voice is heard. I know it's important that my voice is heard. I have seen what being an advocate and an activist in this space does. I've seen the change. When I started this activism in 1997, there were no legal states. Now we're 39 states in, plus many non-state entities that are still associated with the United States that have these programs. Now we're talking about rescheduling. Now we're talking about federal pardons and decriminalization potentially for possession across the country, right? Now we're seeing pardons for possession all over the place in different states. Now we're seeing expungement in different places. Now in places like Michigan, we're seeing complete decriminalization where, you know, regardless of what you're doing with the cannabis plant, licensed, unlicensed, etc., you know, it's no longer probable cause to take all your stuff. And, right, you know, prosecutors who do want to prosecute are having to figure out interesting loopholes like, it's no longer cannabis, it's a controlled substance without calling it cannabis, right? So there are lots of places where we're pushing the aisles of prohibition back, and that is important. And we're not just doing it here, we're doing it around the world. Almost, I believe now with the change in Brazil that happened last week, all of the South American countries, those nations, have decriminalized possession of the cannabis plant, right? Almost all of the states, I think there's only one holdout now that's down there, right? So any time now, and that of course that's just for possession. It's not for cultivation or sales, but still, you know, it's moving the method forward, right? We're seeing major change in Europe on this, right? Almost all European countries now have medical programs, including medical programs that allow the importation of cannabis from other places like South Africa, which has a legal program, like Canada, which has a legal program, right? Like Jamaica, which has a legal program, right? So being able to create these products, you know, in safe ways so that patients know that they're not going to have contaminants on them, and then sending them and making sure that there's access to that plant everywhere else in the world. That was not the case in 1997. Right? So flash forward, I mean, you know, we're really coming up on, what is this, 30 years now of activism on my part and on thousands and thousands of others. And so we know that our voices matter, and we know that the work that we're doing is important, so that everybody has access. You know, if you're in a state right now and you don't have access, you should consider why you don't have access. You should consider that is because legislators have decided not to give it to you, because they're continuing the acts of prohibition. And you should consider that it's because citizens in your state haven't banded together to create petitions to force the legislature to change. You know, have been many states across the country that was the path, that it was citizen-driven change that the legislator could not turn away from, that forced these changes to happen. Right? Now, maybe we'll do it at the national level before other states will get on board, but I have a feeling that that's not going to be the case. You know, we only have 11 states left to get on board. And of those 11 states, only 3 of them have no program at all, right? Where they're not even interested in making sure that there is a program for federally legal hemp products to be used in the state and provided to citizens, right? So, and that continues to be Idaho, Kansas, and Nebraska. Yes, we're looking at you. Even Texas has moved forward now. Kansas, Nebraska, and Idaho. Wake up. Join us on this mission of making sure people have access to a plant that has for generations of time unbound, been improving quality of life and providing people relief. Like, there's really no reason, especially for those places where this plant grows naturally, you know, in ditches all over the place, like Kansas and Nebraska and Idaho. Right? Like, it's been there for like 10,000 years. Don't try to say that it doesn't exist in your state, right? I feel like sometimes people forget that, you know, that prohibition is in place because we continue to say that we want it to be. And the more we use our voices to say that we don't, the closer we're going to get to having it go to where it'll be okay. So all of that being said, there was some pretty cool cannabis science news that came out. I always love this, and I think perhaps Yessie will love this too. And maybe Yessie already knows that this is the case, but a new study coming out from Colorado University in Boulder, right, or the University of Colorado in Boulder, says that cannabis use, especially cannabis use that includes CBD, reduces inflammation, which has now been shown to reduce the incidence and severity of diabetes, as well as anxiety, for a nice controlled set of people who are looking at it. This study will continue as well in the state of Colorado, from CU Boulder, right? And I'll tell you, I always figured that this was the case because, you know, the cannabis plant had been used for generations to stop these issues, right? Oh man, I had the worst day ever. Let me smoke this bowl so that I can have a nice evening with my family, right? Or, you know, how many cannabis consumers out there do you know that are really just the most anxious folks in the world? I mean, I guess there's some, but we've known these things for a long time, and now we have some clinical science to back these things up. There's been 30,000 clinical trials with the plant. You know, when people tell you, oh, there hasn't been any research, we don't know the answers to these things. No, it isn't that we haven't done research. We've done a lot of research, right? And even before doing clinical research was a thing, because that really just started in the 1900s, right? We had been using the plant for thousands of years in ways to improve quality of life, right? And now we have clinical data to back that up. We may not have drug products with phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, but that doesn't mean that clinical research hasn't been done. That doesn't mean that we don't understand the harms. That doesn't mean we don't understand the adverse events that can happen, right? And let's talk about those for a little bit. It says, you know, here, I like to always try to balance things, right? So, hey, your diabetes is going to be helped because you're consuming cannabis, especially if it has CBD in it. And you might get dry eyes. And you might get dry mouth. And you might get lung irritation that causes a cough, right? These are all things that we know from consuming cannabis, right? And you can get dry eyes and dry mouth without smoking cannabis, right? Just by consuming cannabis in any way, whether you're vaping or eating edibles, right? This is a response to the plant when it interacts with our CB1 and CB2 receptors in our body, in our endocannabinoid system, right? So those things happen. And strangely enough, those might be considered side effects if we actually called cannabis a drug, and as though it was approved by the FDA for usage. All right. So there's been a lot of that. There's a lot of science that's still going on. There was a court case recently that said that people can continue doing research in the state of California, which had been put on pause for a while, which is always great news. You know, yeah, it always makes me wonder, like, why do they want us to stop doing research? They say that they want research, but then they do everything in their power to make it so that we can't do it. Again, a prohibitionist mindset that thinks that that's really dangerous and we shouldn't be able to use it. We shouldn't be able to use it to do science because somehow if we get better science, we're going to harm people. That's the prohibitionist mindset, right? We don't want it. They think that the product, that the plant is so dangerous that's going to harm you and it's going to harm your children. And it's just not the case. And we know it's not the case. We know that the premise for it has always been wrong. We know that way back in the day when Nixon decided to create the DEA, that he knew then, right? They had done a government study with amazing subject matter experts and scientists, and it said clearly, there's no reason for us to do this. And they decided to do it anyway, right? Not based on the science. not based on its actual safety. So being advocates and activists and saying, hey, we don't want to do that anymore. We don't want to tell people that they need to be afraid when they don't actually need to be afraid. We don't want to tell youth that cannabis is like heroin when actually it's not, which is what we've been doing for like the last 50 years, right? So there's many ways we can do that. All right, so yesterday was a holiday. You all are probably still on your holiday. I'd like to talk to you about some people who hopefully will be joining us very soon. I'm really hopeful to be joined by Michael Webster, coming here to talk to us about what's happening in the cannabis community here in Michigan and in other states, and how he's bringing them together with amazing networking events. And he's crossing intersectional communities. So not just industry professionals, but consumers, advocates, activists, lobbyists, legislators, etc., all coming together under one roof to enjoy cannabis together and have those good conversations like we're having right now, right? I'm really hoping that Maddie Grant will be able to come and talk to us about more science that's happening, not just in Colorado, but all over the country, and the kind of science that we can look at. There's been some really amazing white papers that have come out recently looking at the way cannabis can be used to reduce opiate usage. And I think that is something that we all care about, because we know we still have an opioid crisis in our country, and that crisis is killing people. And if we can use cannabis to reduce that harm, why are we not doing it actively? If the president says we don't want any more people to die from opiate overdoses and we'll do anything to do that, why didn't that include legalizing cannabis so that people can have access to that? Because we are seeing a 40% reduction in usage of opiates and a 60% reduction in opiate deaths in most legalized states. Think about that. Half of the people who would be dying are not dying because they have access to a different substance, which is giving them the relief that they need so that they are not killing themselves with opiates. Half. Why aren't we doing more of that? Please, Maddie, come talk to us a little bit more about that. Hopefully we'll also be talking to Connie Sparrow. She should be coming in here and talking to us about cannabis tourism, which is a huge new type of tourism that's happening all over the country. If you live in a licensed legal state and you are near an unlicensed state, you may have experienced cannabis tourists, right? And how can you create safe spaces for those tourists? How can you be welcome to those tourists? How can you engage with those tourists? And what is it like to be a tourist yourself, right? If you are thinking about going on a trip and you're a cannabis consumer, are you thinking about, can I bring my cannabis with me? Is that part of your conversation? Are you interested in looking at other types of things? Do you worry about whether or not your Airbnb or your hotel room will allow you to have the products that you are used to having for your quality of life and for your medical conditions? If the answer is yes, I knew it, and so did Connie. And that is how she is pushing forward with this bold new industry. So hopefully she'll be here to talk to us soon. And of course, Josh from Infinite Cal had said that he would come and talk to us about all the testing that he has done and the world around us and the lawsuits that are being brought to bring these fraudulent test labs to question. And hopefully prevent them from being able to provide fraudulent information in the future. I'm excited for him to come, and I'm really, really hopeful for that. And as we come to the close of today, I just wanted to say that it's important that you let me know what you're thinking. What do you want to hear about? I'm making up everything as I go along. Okay. I'm not actually making it up, but I'm bringing you the news that I think is important to me. Perhaps there's news that's more important to you. Maybe you're interested in more cannabis pop culture and I've never even discussed it. And you're like, hey, how come that never gets discussed? Perhaps you want me to be talking about what's going on in Iowa right now, which if you haven't been listening, they just decided in the legislature that they're going to limit federally legal hemp products and the level of amount of potency that can be included there. So products that you might have been able to get at the grocery store or your local convenience shop, now are going to be a lot different because the legislature just put limits on those where they didn't have any before, right? Or maybe you're like, hey, what's going on in Puerto Rico, Cass? And I've never talked at all about what's going on in Puerto Rico, but there's lots of stuff going on down there too, right? So if you have things, you're interested, you have questions, please, please, please reach out. Ask me anything. I will find you the answer. If I can't find you the answer, I will find you a subject matter expert that can. even if that means bringing you on to have the conversation here with me. All right, so I hope that you are all enjoying a nice holiday week and getting ready for a holiday weekend, and I will see you next Friday. This is Cass, signing off.